Good morning, everyone. I'm Kevin Allen, and I'm joined by my usual podcast partner, former NHL defenseman Tom Laidlaw, who played, of course, for the New York Rangers and Los Angeles Kings. And last night he joined us on day one of our draft coverage. And now we are into day two, which means it's still sort of Christmas morning because there'll be gifts under the tree. We just may not know them, and we won't know for 2 or 3 years.
That was excellent last night, too. The guys you had on the show, Russ Cohen and everything, all the information they had about the draft eligible players, that was good.
Yeah, no, it was fun. I really looked forward to it, and I liked our approach, and I was a little concerned because we had cast of thousands there up on our screen, but everybody had their part. It was great to have a former NHL player on there who could talk about the first time when you were drafted, and you of course are a former agent, so we could talk about that, and you were there for trade analysis as well. And Russ Cohen, as you said, has been a sort of a draft scouting expert for more than a decade, and is often on Sirius Radio, but really knows the draft. And there was not a single player I shouldn't say that. There was one guy that, of course, nobody knew. I believe the Columbus Blue Jackets took him, and I can't even think of his name right now. But Russ had never seen him or heard of him.
I do remember that. Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. So it was a little bit shocking, and but anyway, that draft virtually was not everyone's cup of tea. If you look at social media, not everybody loved it. But I thought it had its moments. Now we didn't get to see them all because we were doing our own coverage, but. From what I was told, it was a special moment when Doug Wilson Jr. Had learned how to sign using sign language. Put the name of the draft pick that went 31st, whose name escapes me right now, because his mother was deaf, and they wanted to be able to let her sort of know first. Yep. And Alex Trebek, bringing him in, that's brilliant.
I was shocked. The other one was good too. Was Winnipeg with Dale Hawerchuk.
Oh yeah, that's touching.
Right, all the 10s involved. This was the 10th year in Winnipeg. Hawerchuk wore number 10. They were getting the 10th pick overall. It was just all fell together, right? So
and that was that was touching as well. I mean, Dale Hawerchuk was so popular.
Yeah, it's amazing.
In Winnipeg, and a lot of Americans, I don't think, realized what an exceptional player he was, because in the early 80s, like we think now, like you see every team and we know everything about what's going on in every corner of the NHL because of social media. But you remember, it wasn't like that in the early 80s. Like what was going on in the West was just a rumor.
And that was during the Wayne Gretzky era too, where Western Canada, well, the whole hockey world really, but especially in Western Canada, also Winnipeg and Edmonton, Gretzky was it. The Hawerchuk was, I had to play against him all the time. And he wasn't just talented, but he was a tough little guy too. Not as much as a fighting tough kind of guy, but like skilled players, you can intimidate him. You cross check him in front of the net or punch him in the head and they're going to run away. But not him. He kept battling all the time. He was really good. And it is amazing too. Even after the game, how many people he's touched, like all the accolades that come out, since he got sick and then ultimately passed away. But no, it was quite great. His wife did a great job getting up there and speaking to it. It was good.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, if for Detroit fans, if you're either too young or don't remember seeing much of Hawerchuk, just think of Steve Yzerman.
Yeah.
That's, he was to Winnipeg what Yzerman was to Detroit in terms of, and I always, when I think of eras and what happened, I think of Yzerman and Hawerchuk the way, they came right out of juniors and they were, they played and they had impact. Right. They were drafted, they came into their teams, and right away they were 30-goal scorers or more. Right. And then the game became about hooking and holding and obstructing, and suddenly physical strength became so important because you needed to fight through all that to get to the net. Well, guys coming out of the draft didn't have that physical strength. So then they stopped being able to come out of junior and using their incredible skill to do it because they couldn't get to the net because they weren't strong enough. And then, of course, we changed the game with the rule reformation during the lost season, which said, you couldn't, hold those guys up along the boards when they were entering the zone. Like, just think of old Brian Rafalski, squeezing that guy along into the boards when he was coming over. Well, that's interference today.
Yeah, it's funny you talk like that too, because I remember I was one of the guys. If a young player came into the league, intimidation was a tactic in the game.
Right.
And, I remember guys like, I hate to be like this with him because I'm going to mention his name. Brian Lott, when he came in, he got the reputation that if you were going to be rough with him, he would not fight back. So obviously, if you knew that, well, you're going to be rough with him. Like the guys that learn, at least push back a little bit, then you think, okay, it's not working, so I don't really need it's pointless to go be rough with him. But we would talk openly in the locker room before the game, go punch him in the head first shift, and he'll disappear, and that's what would happen. And and to a certain extent, Lemieux and Yzerman and those guys were kind of like that too. Not that they would disappear, but if you got physical with them, you could see that they weren't quite the same player. Now, as they went through their career, that shifted, and they became the total opposite. I mean, you tell the stories all the time about Steve Yzerman playing with all the injuries he played with and blocking shots. Mario Lemieux coming back from cancer and everything. So it was, they really grew up and got stronger and tougher. But
that ability to squeeze and erase players coming into the zone too. I think about it. One of the things I remember is Rob Blake. I wrote a book called Crunch. I don't know, must have been 30 years ago now. It's a long time ago. And one of the things I talked about was sort of the art of physical play. And one of it's a lost art now, but back then we were in the sort of the tail end of it, was the hip check. Yeah. And players used to tell me that when Rob Blake, they saw him coming, and he had that big old rear end. And he said it was almost like when you're watching those, fighter pilots, and they go, I got lock. Yeah. He said, Blake would get a lock on you with that big rear end, as he goes, and you saw it coming, and you just couldn't get out of the way, and he would just drive you, into the boards with that big.
The other guy, surprisingly, that I thought was one of the best at it I ever saw was Kurt Giles. Played most of his career with Minnesota, came drafted to the Rangers before I got drafted to LA, so I played with him. And man, for a small guy too, he was just like a little fire hydrant. So a different story. Right? Blake's this big man coming at you, but Giles is this little guy. And I think a lot of people, if you didn't play against him enough, you kind of got deceived, thinking this guy's not going to hurt me or whatever. And he really, man, he got low to the ground and just took some people out. He was very good at it. Yeah, it is an art too.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Rob Blake, two points I'd like to make about him. I've heard a lot of Hall of Fame speeches, but Rob Blake's speaking from the cup, I actually thought I had to go look to make sure there wasn't a teleprompter, because he just got up there and talked off his cuff, and he was brilliant. He told stories about his dad and everything else. And after his speech was over, I really did turn around to make sure there was not a teleprompter, because I couldn't believe it. Yeah. It was like he had memorized the most incredible speech, but really he just went. There was no pausing. He didn't struggle to find the words. It just came all flowing out. And then the other point I wanted to make is I've heard through the grapevine, there was some discussion, and I think there was some disagreement about who the Kings should take at number 2 last night. And Stutzel, some of the scouts thought, this was the speed guy, this is the dynamic guy, and versus Byfield. And people compared him to Evgeny Malkin. Once you say that to me, I'm sold. You say a guy might be Malkin, I'm in. But anyway, there was dispute, and I heard basically Rob Blake said, no, Byfield's the guy, and that he made his decision. And I like that. I like a GM who listens to everybody, weighs it all, and then but the buck stops with him. So if that's
that's really important too. I think the battles to fight for a scout, to fight for his player, I think are really important. I remember we had David Poyle on, you and I, a long time ago, and I was kind of joking about Paul Fenton. Paul Fenton was a former teammate of mine with the Kings and was the, I guess, assistant general manager there. And sometimes when you talk to Paul, if you didn't know any better, he'd talk like he was actually the general manager of the Nashville Predators. And I kind of joked around with David like that. And I was really surprised the way David said it. That's what he wanted. He wants his people to really tell him don't agree with me on anything. You're the one that's been out there scouting those players. Fight for your guy. So the scouts I talk to, they talk all the time about a lot of their meetings where they really have battles. Guys, the boss wants them to fight for their player, and that's good scouting too. So, but you're right with Rob Blake. So at the end of the day, somebody's got to make the decision who the right guy is, right?
Well, that was Ken Holland's management style in Detroit. I'm assuming it's the same way in Edmonton. He was kind of like the president, and he had his cabinet. He'd have these meetings, and he'd have Jimmy Devellano and Mark Howell, the pro scout, and all the guys that he trusted. And then he'd go around the room, and everybody would voice their opinion. and then he would take all that in and channel that information, and then come up with the final decision. But he realized it was his call, but he wanted differing opinions, and he got them. Jimmy Devellano was not, a former general manager himself, was not afraid to say, and that had to be a little bit difficult for Ken Holland, because Devellano was so tight with ownership.
Yeah, I know.
So, like, who's more powerful than the king?
Yeah.
It's the bishop who's whispering in the king's ear. So that must have been interesting. Speaking of Ken Holland, and I want to get your thoughts on this. We've heard now through the grapevine that today, a 5 o'clock deadline, and Larry Brooks of the New York Post has written about this too very well, because the Rangers are dealing with Ryan Strome, qualifying offers. I talked to David Poyle the other night, and he doesn't have one, but he said to me there are going to be players, surprising players, who are not going to be qualified. And it has everything to do, not with regard to the player's talent, but it has everything to do with your salary cap situation, and the fact that you've got to preserve space and you have to prioritize players, and the guy that maybe is up for salary arbitration isn't as valuable as a guy that you got to get signed. Right. Your thoughts on that? Let's start specifically with the Rangers. Do you keep Ryan Strome, or do you let him try his hand at free agency and go back to him and try to get him for a lesser amount of money?
So just so everybody understands, a qualifying offer is under the collective bargaining agreement. The team has to, by a certain date, so it's 5 o'clock today, make an offer to the player. And it's like a certain percentage. I think it's a 10% bump on their current salary. I think what it was anyways. So if they don't make that offer in time, then yes, he becomes an unrestricted free agent. I guess, if you got a guy, that's going to go to arbitration, the reason teams don't like arbitration so much is a third party is deciding what that player is going to get paid. So you're going into the arbitration kind of like, it could be, there's a range here. And depending on the player, it could be a big range. And if it goes too high, it could really hurt your salary cap situation. So, I think it's a real possibility, because, again, that's one of those things they can't control if the player goes to arbitration. So, Strome is an interesting player. He's that kind of guy. He's really, I wouldn't say he's a number 2 centerman by any means, but he's a good number 3. And based on where the Rangers are at right now, they really don't have that true number 2 centerman. So, do they need him, or do they think they've got enough of good young players? And again, I hope the Ranger fans, I see that I take this the right way. The Rangers are still in that developmental stage where they're not a Stanley Cup contender right now, right? So do you say to yourself, any player, but in this case, Strome, it's important enough that we need to keep him to go on our run? So I would think that, I think he may be the odd man out. I guess the other guy would be, Tony DeAngelo, what they do with him too. They drafted another they moved up to draft another defenseman last night. But I mean, that defenseman they drafted last night isn't going to be ready for a good 2 or 3 years to really be an impact player. So, but the same thing with DeAngelo, he's got arbitration rights too. So, and he would he's got some good numbers. So
real good numbers. Yeah. Well, let's get right into that, because I think this is a good. We have a lot of Ranger fans who view our show, and there's a lot of interest in the Rangers anyway. The Ryan Strome situation, like, Ryan Strome is a valuable piece to a team, because he's a number 3 guy who can play number 2 if you need to. Yep. You're probably would prefer to have him in on third line. And, if he's your third line, then you're doing pretty well. Yep. But, there are other priorities that, and, like I said, it's not his fault. Like, there were times when he played pretty darn well for the Rangers. Right. So it's a difficult decision. I think the DeAngelo decision, though, is even a more difficult one. Like, he played really, really well. And he came a long way when you consider that he was sort of in the doghouse with Quinn at the beginning, and then had to sort of fight his way and sort of learned what he needed to do in order to be successful. Yep. And boy, you start listing, the better offensive puck moving defenseman. He's up there. But because he's up there, I think there's pretty good trade value for him.
Well, I was just going to say that exactly.
Yeah. So,
especially when they've already got Trouba and Fox on the right side, and DeAngelo's the right side.
Right. So, like, all those things add up to, you got to move somebody because that's just the way of the pandemic world now. The salary cap is going to stay flat. They talked about 2 years. Now GMs are talking to me 3 years. That's the way they see it. It's going to take a while to get that revenue back up there. So flat for 3 years. Now you're projecting ahead. You got to really watch that. Like, people are saying, Joe Sakic in Colorado, spend that money. Well, Joe, I'm sure is thinking, yeah, but I got all these guys coming up. I got to hold that money to get, make sure that I have enough to pay my top players when they're up, because maybe they're up next year or the year after. So you do got to be careful.
And one of the things that hurts the Rangers, because they've done such a good job with the rebuild, and they've got all these good young players coming up, and everybody will see, well, they got all cap space now. They got rid of Henrik Lundqvist and made other moves and everything. But you got to remember when those rookies are on the rookie contracts, there's a lot of bonuses involved. So you may see a base salary, but there's all these other bonuses that only rookies and players over 35 years old can get. There are no other performance bonuses in other contracts. So you don't see the bonuses, but they're there. I mean, the league forces, if a player can earn like $1 million as a salary, but he can earn $500,000 in bonuses, that $500,000 has to be allotted for in the cap in case he earns that $500,000, so that you don't go over the cap. So that really cuts into again, that's a great thing. You've got all these great young players, but that's kind of the bad thing. It's not necessarily that they will always reach all the bonuses, but that has to be allotted for under the cap. So that cuts into your cap space as well. So, it is a tough spot, and but you said it right. I mean, we look back when Chicago won their Stanley Cups and all the players they had to trade away when they won all their cups. That's part of the byproduct. You have a good team, good players making good money, and you've got to move players out of there. And that's the general manager looking ahead and saying, how do we forecast this, drafting well, developing players properly. And the Rangers have done that.
Back when we had that the lost season, we came out of that and we had a salary cap. I remember general managers specifically saying, it's going to change now because we're going to end up, you have players and they'll perform well for you, but you got this cap you got to deal with. So you'll wave goodbye to them and you bring in new players. The NFL does that all the time.
Well, and that's what you have to do.
But we didn't do that. In the NHL, we didn't act like the NFL. What did we do? We signed all our players. We re-signed them. Yeah. Like we didn't have the turnover. Like there'd be 1 or 2 or 3 players in the marketplace. There wasn't 20, as GMs predicted. Like, They thought every summer, there was going to be a turnover of, 1/10 of the league. It would be, free agents. It just didn't happen that way.
I somewhat, and I'm not saying disagree with your statement, but I've heard people say, like in Chicago, for example, so they won their cups and they give the big contracts to Taves and Kane. And people say, well, they're rewarding them for winning the Stanley Cup. I don't think they rewarded them for winning the Stanley Cup. I think they were just still good players that they didn't want to lose. Or still good term of their careers. So.
Well, and while they did rebuild for each different Stanley Cup, and if you look at it, they changed. Those core 5 or 6 players remained. Taves, Kane, Duncan Keith, Seabrook. Those guys were all there, and leading the way. And ultimately, probably it hurt them because now Seabrook is setting, and it's almost like dead money because he's.
I want some play. Is he really playing that bad that he can't get in the lineup sometimes?
Yeah, well, I would say no, but he's obviously not the player he was before. But I would say he's still serviceable. But the comparison of the $7 million versus, like he was a force.
Yeah.
Before, what he was like, and especially at playoff time. Totally. Like he was just so important to the team. So, but we're going to be dealing with those issues where we still got Tampa Bay. I saw they got Mitchell Stevens signed yesterday, so it's 1 down and 5 to go. They've got all those players: Cirelli, Sergachev. Who am I forgetting? Somebody else.
There's a highlight. There's a headline on I think it was in TSN saying that Stamkos is not one of the untouchables.
Yeah, no, I saw that. Bob McKenzie, who's gone into retirement or semi-retirement, comes back for the draft, steps out of retirement, and 10 minutes later, he's got this great scoop about, hey, don't rule out Steven Stamkos.
Speaking of the Rangers, how confident are we that Lundqvist is going to sign with Washington on Friday?
I'm very confident. I've heard GMs, GMs basically have told me that they are pretty sure that's what's going to happen. And one of them was a GM who was very interested in Lundqvist. So he told me he felt that Lundqvist was signed and sealed. Then, that makes some sense. I think what it says is that they're concerned about Samsonov's off-season injury, and described as a freak accident, which is always a little scary. Lundqvist is still in the East.
Yep.
He knows the players there. He knows the shooters. He knows everything about it. It's not that different. He's not far from Manhattan where he's got to play. So all that makes perfect sense to me. That's a contending team. It's hard to. I mean, you could say, why don't you go to Colorado? But if he goes to Colorado, that's a different conference.
And apparently Colorado was interested too, right?
Yeah, for sure. That's what I heard. So I hear too that Joe Sakic is interested in Corey Crawford in Chicago. That negotiations there haven't gone well with Crawford, and if he becomes available, I think Sakic might inquire about them. And you think about that, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Who knows more about Corey Crawford aside from the Chicago Blackhawks than Joe Sakic, who's watched him within the division and kind of knows him quite well. And the other thing that's almost forgotten is Corey Crawford played well last season.
He is one of those guys. We've talked about this before. That for some reason I watch him play and I just not sold on him. But then he's won cups, he's won big games, he's a competitor. You see the way his teammates talk about him. So it's great. There's something I'm missing there. He gets the job done. I guess it's the way he plays.
I talked recently to someone within the Chicago organization, who told me if it wasn't for Leonard and Crawford, we would have been the worst team in the Western Conference.
Wow.
Yeah. Like he said, those guys were so good. They basically made up for the fact of the inconsistency of the Chicago defense.
Right.
Chicago's offense, obviously, they got Kane. They got Taves. They got players. I think they can compete offensively. They just don't have the defense.
So how then is Henrik Lundqvist? So how is the Washington Capitals? Do the players on the Washington Capitals going, okay, now we got a shot of winning? And do they, or is
I think everyone knows Samsonov is a good player, but he doesn't have the pedigree that Lundqvist has.
Yeah, totally.
And here's the thing: Backstrom and Lundqvist, I've heard are friends, so I think that was played a role in his decision to go there. But look at a lot of the guys there. Ovechkin obviously is a big time international player, likes to go to the World Championships every year. Very familiar with Lundqvist, not only from the Rangers but international hockey. He's watched Lundqvist win in the Olympics and World Championships and so forth.
All-star games are always together.
Yeah. So I think this was probably a very popular decision among the players there. And especially with the leadership group, Backstrom and Ovechkin. So I would think that's a good move. And
I wonder, Brian McClellan, a former Ranger, a former teammate of mine, now general manager in Washington. You got to wonder how long. It's not. I guess he's still got a little bit of rope left before he's in trouble. But they win the cup, and then they let your relative go, Barry Trotz, go to the Islanders. And then the guy that they pegged to be the next guy coming along as a coach, they fire him after 2 years.
Yeah, Reardon didn't work out.
Yes. So now, and George McPhee, another former Ranger, was really the guy that built the bulk of that roster there. Now they're going after Lundqvist. If that doesn't work out for him, you got to be looking like, is Big Mac, is he in trouble there? Because really, he hasn't, to his credit, he really hasn't done much to build on top of the current roster that's already there. If anything, you would say that the team looks like they're on the decline a little bit.
Yeah, I didn't like the Niskanen trade, but of course Niskanen just retired. I want to get into that a little bit. So, I didn't like that move, and they've been hamstrung by salary as well. So when you say that, like, part of the modern GM's, maybe a big part of the modern GM's job is management of cap.
Oh, totally.
And so when you get in those situations, and some of it's unavoidable. Yeah. Seriously, just the way of the world. If your players are going to get better under your tutelage, they're going to want more money.
Yeah,
so some of it is unavoidable. Yeah, but not all of it. You got to plan for it.
Yes, exactly. Totally. Yeah.
So anyway, so that's that's an issue there. But anyway, let's step over to Niskanen now, because this caught the Flyers by complete surprise.
Totally.
Matti Niskanen, who they knew was not thrilled about playing in the bubble, had just concerns about it. Now, the thing about that struck me, I had to go look this up. How old do you think Matti Niskanen is?
I was just thinking that myself. I was going to look it up. I'm going to guess 30 years old.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
He's soon to be 34.
Oh.
So he's older than I thought he was. So, I mean, this is when players used to retire.
Yeah.
When they, before. That's not when they retire now, but that's when they used to retire.
He's one of those guys that's got a pretty solid game. It's not like, he's really wear and tear on his body all the time, or like he's just that guy that comes and does his job every night. He's not a big, huge hitter, although he's a physical player. So it's not like you're saying he's not beat up and he's retiring. You kind of wonder that he could play another 5 years.
Well, I mean, this seemed like it was a family consideration. Yeah. The thought of, they're talking about perhaps a regional bubble this year and all that kind of stuff. He just said, I'm just not doing that.
Yeah.
He's got plenty of money.
He's not really retired. He's retired for now, but he's going to make a comeback.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's possible. I guess that's possible, but you might be right. And I think that's a good prediction. I want to, we sort of glossed over this, but I wanted to talk about this a little bit because I think it's kind of fun, and I like these kinds of things. I love rivalries in sports. Yeah. And Larry Brooks, Larry Brooks is a Hall of Fame writer, and I always like the little things he picks up. Like, they're much better than some of the bigger things that he's gotten. But
and may I add too, Larry is an equal opportunity
basher.
Yeah, he does not care who it is.
Yeah, he'll go after him if he feels the person, and he has no sacred cows.
Yes,
So, but anyway, Larry reported this morning, and I read it, and I just smiled because I just love these kind of things. The Rangers moved up to get Braden Schneider, who is a Rock'em Sock'em, Tom Laidlaw style defenseman, and he's listed as very steady, very dependable, but he's a big hitter, big hitter. Right. But anyway, they moved up because they thought the New Jersey Devils were going to take the player in front of them. And what I like about that is like there's two missions for the New York Rangers. Yeah. There's winning the Stanley Cup and to be better than the Devils. Yeah. Now, the Devils are just they're not even in the same hemisphere with the Rangers in terms of fan appeal or national appeal or anything else. Like, the Devils, despite having won a lot of cups under Lou Lamoriello, struggled to maintain sort of an identity in that area. I mean, you still get so many Ranger fans at Ranger Devil games and everything else, but that doesn't matter. Like, the Rangers have to be better and get ahead of the Devils, regardless of that.
Can you imagine the heat if it got out that the Rangers wanted that player, didn't take him right away, and then the Devils took him? I mean, that'd be more. Yeah. Now they'd have to play against that player who's a physical player. They don't want to play against. So, that's you know what? I didn't know that until I read that this morning, but that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the joys of sports, when you can have a fun rivalry like that. And I used to love the Islander rivalries. Like, I love going to Madison Square Gardens in the old days and the Pot Van Sucks chant. And
it's still there, but it was even better.
Yeah, it was just so much fun back then. And
and speak of that rivalry too, I think I told you a story. I do that other podcast with Ron Greshner and Dave Maloney on Thursdays. And we've had two former Islanders, John Tonelli, and the real surprise was when Clark Gillies contacted me, wanted to be on the show, and I was like, "What, are you going to beat us up again or something?" But it was very interesting talking to him about the rivalry we had, and they were very complimentary, especially like the last time the Islanders went to the finals. They ultimately lost. They'd won their 4 cups and then lost to the Oilers. We almost had them, beat them in the opening round in a game 5 or 5-game series. And Kenny Morrow scored the winning goal. But both those guys said that they felt like if we didn't beat them, that we were going to go to the Stanley Cup Finals and potentially beat the Oilers. So it was interesting hearing them talk about how they, because all we ever saw before was how we hated each other, and it was really interesting, the bond we kind of had, the way we talked about each other on the podcast. It was good.
Well, I remember at the start of my career at USA Today, and I started covering the league on a national basis in 1986. And I've said for a long time that my favorite place to be was Montreal during playoffs because there was so much excitement on the street. You could feel, the hockey. As soon as you got in the city, like the cab driver would engage you and, what do you think is going to happen tonight? Like everybody's getting. Well, I remember distinctly going to Ranger Islanders games in the 80s as well. And, walking up to Madison Square Garden and feeling a very similar energy.
Yeah.
When the Islanders and Rangers were going to play, and you saw the mix of Islander jerseys were milling about, having guys that just come out of the bar, and you could just sense it. Like even if the game wasn't all that meaningful.
Totally. Like even a preseason game, our preseason games were wars. I mean, it was like, because in some ways it was even worse because it didn't matter who won the game. It was people settling old scores or making a statement about the future or young guys trying to make the team. Yeah, like every Ranger Islander game, the whole building, there was more fights in the stands than there was on the ice too. So the whole place was just a bottle of hate. It was just both teams hated each other. But looking back at it too, it's like, I think from our end especially, we really respected them a lot, but it was just, they were beating us all the time too. So
yeah. Well, even the irony of the pot man sucks, comment. I mean, obviously pot man didn't suck, far from it. But and that was just and still is. It's still a good rivalry. Not like it was.
They used to throw the rotten old fish at his feet during the national anthem. Like he'd stand there, this dead fish. It would smell the whole rink up. It was pretty funny, and it is still funny. Like you can go to Yankee games now, and they'll still do the Potvin Stucks. Like I'll take somebody to the game, and I'll say, "Listen, if you hear this whistling start, because they started off with this whistling, and then everybody goes Potvin Sucks." And most people don't even know. I think a lot of people now don't even know why they do it.
Well. I think there's less romance now in the game, those kind of things. And some of it is, the entertainment there is so orchestrated, and the music and what's coming down and all the, videos that they have and all that kind of stuff. There's almost like no room anymore to throw an octopus or to throw a dead fish or to do pop. You don't hear them as well anymore because and the guys, like the entertainment that they have that's orchestrated is quite funny often as well. But, it just isn't the same as used to be able to go to Maple Leaf Garden and you could hear players curse at each other because it was so quiet. And now, of course, all that is lost. But anyway, we have, as usual, we've gone beyond our limit here, but we appreciate you stopping in, and we'll be back again next week. We now know, we didn't even talk about this today, but we now know we're going to start the NHL season on January 1st. I wonder if that means we're going to have a Winter Classic that day.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
That's how we're going to launch the season. But hockey's coming. Coming. We're not that far off, folks.
I like that. That is interesting. Good thinking by you. That's a real coincidence, right? The name January 1st and all of a sudden, that's it. Good.
Yep. So anyway, thanks for joining us, guys.
See you Monday, everybody.